collapse of Rome and monetary policy. When people imagine the destruction of Rome, they usually visualize the same scenes: barbarians breaking down the gates, legions being torn to pieces, emperors being poisoned in their palaces. But the reason empires collapse is not just attacks from the outside. The real collapse begins from within. And one of the biggest factors accelerating this collapse is money. Rome did not fall just because of invasions or corruption. It fell because its money collapsed. And interestingly, the lessons to be drawn from those mistakes are still valid today, because we still live in a world full of governments saying, "Let's print some money, no one will notice." Trust and the denarius. At the foundation of Rome's economy was a silver coin called the denarius. When it was first minted, it consisted of almost entirely pure silver. People trusted this money because it had real value. Soldiers' salaries were paid with it, merchants accepted it, and the public made their savings with it. In other words, it wasn't just about metal, it was a matter of trust. But as the empire grew, so did the expenses. The salaries of the armies, wars, roads, aqueducts, all required serious money. When the state treasury began to struggle, instead of collecting more taxes from the people, rulers resorted to an easy method: reducing the silver content within the money. The beginning of inflation. From the outside, the money looked the same, but its content was no longer as it used to be. In the period of Augustus, the denarius contained about 95% silver. As the years passed, this ratio dropped and dropped. Eventually, in some periods, it fell below even 5%. In other words, what people held in their hands was no longer real silver money, but pieces of cheap metal carrying a thin silver plating. And people noticed this. This was exactly the breaking point, because what we call money is actually a collective belief. When people stop saying, "This is valuable," the system begins to crack. Economic collapse and consequences. What happened next? Prices rose. The money that could buy a loaf of bread yesterday began to be insufficient for anything today. Soldiers demanded higher salaries. Merchants did not want to accept the worthless money. People turned back to bartering. Trade slowed down. Trust was lost. But instead of accepting the cause of the problem, the Roman administration continued to print more money. Because in the short term, it seemed to work. Isn't this exactly what many states are doing today? By the time the 3rd century arrived, things went completely out of control. Civil wars, epidemics, economic crises. Emperors were being dethroned or killed within a few months. The state tried to forcibly fix prices to keep the system afloat. It even set the prices of some goods and punished those who did not follow the rules with death. History repeating itself. Germany and Zimbabwe. But the problem wasn't the prices. The problem was that people no longer trusted the money, because you cannot make a devalued currency valuable by passing a law. The black market grew, and the official economy began to collapse. Finally, Rome had to abandon the old monetary system. New gold coins were minted, but it was too late. The economic foundation of the empire had rotted from the inside out. And in fact, the rest of history is full of similar stories. In Germany after the First World War, the government constantly printed money to cover its debts. The result? The hyperinflation of 1923. People were carrying their salaries in wheelbarrows because money was losing value within hours. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe. The state printed money incessantly, and eventually, prices began to change several times a day. People gave up their own currency and switched to using the dollar. Today in the fundamental lesson, Today, the system looks different, but the logic hasn't changed much. Now, instead of gold, there are monetary systems based entirely on trust. States get into debt. Central banks print trillions, and this is often called economic growth. But ordinary people feel something else. Salaries increase, but life becomes more expensive. The nominal value of money grows, but purchasing power shrinks. The story of Rome gives us a very simple but harsh lesson. When a society's money weakens, not only the economy but also the sense of trust collapses. Because money is not just a tool for exchange. It is the collective faith of people in the future. When that faith is lost, society begins to dissolve bit by bit. Contracts lose their meaning. Trade breaks down. Trust in the state diminishes. And eventually the system disintegrates, not from the outside, but from within. Perhaps the real collapse of Rome had begun not when the barbarians arrived at the gate, but when people looked at the money in their pockets and said, "This is no longer worth anything."